Hi, this is Alyssa Farmer, and you're watching a presentation on how Canada funds its education system. All the information provided in this video is cited and can be seen at the end of the presentation. I would like to start out with an introduction and thinking of how the U.S. could improve its education funding system. I think it would be important for them to observe and take note of the methods of other high-achieving countries. So why look at Canada? Well, they are one of these high-achieving countries. They consistently perform well on international tests. There are 7 key findings that I found while doing this research. The first is that we will be looking at 3 different provinces. These provinces have successfully transitioned from a joint provincial-local funding system where their province and local government combined to provide funding for schools to a provincial level funding system where all funding solely comes from the provincial government level. Each province that we're going to be looking at has taken a different approach to this system. That means there's a great deal of flexibility to be looked at. Each province maintains and reinforces a strong commitment to local control over education, and a province-level funding system may allow for a more stable and predictable school budget. These provincial-level funding systems serve as a clear reminder that how money is spent is just as important as the source of the funding. Provincial-level funding systems are not without drawbacks, but it provides a more equitable funding system and is worth considering. Alright, so let's look at Canada. They are our wonderful neighbor to the north, and they are divided into several different provinces. This is similar to how the U.S. is divided up into states, so you could kind of compare these provinces to the states. We're going to look at 3 separate provinces. The first one will be Alberta, followed by British Columbia, and Ontario, and we'll be getting into those in a little while. Let's continue with some background information. I want to start by talking about equity in school funding. Alright, so this means that all districts and schools receive resources based on the educational needs of their specific students. If you think of your classroom, you might have all English-speaking students, but if you do have English as second language students, then you're going to need some more resources for them. Equality is a little bit different, and we will be looking at equality when we talk about how schools earn their money or the money is distributed to them. And equality is just going to mean that the schools are going to be given money based on a per pupil basis. Alright, this money can come from federal, state, or local governments, and is allocated based on the differing needs of students and not based on the wealth of a district or school. So even if you live in a wealthier district, you're going to get the same amount of resources, or the funding is going to be provided in the same way as a school with less wealth. Alright, a little background on the education in Canada. Alright, there is no federal department in education. They do not receive funding or do not receive any control from the federal government. Everything is at a province level. The Canadian Constitution gives exclusive power to these provinces to make laws in relations to education. And the provincial governments have historically shared the responsibility of funding schools with local municipalities and school boards. And again, we'll get into that in just a minute. Alright, so these 3 provinces we're going to look at: Alberta, British Columbia, and Ontario. These are 3 of the 4 most populous provinces where the student populations are similar in size to the schools in most U.S. states. These are the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd rate provinces in Canada, and if you were to take these provinces and make them their own countries, they would be the 5th, 6th, and 8th country ranked in the world. Both Ontario and Alberta students score the same or better than the U.S. in 8th grade math and science. Alright, I want to start out by talking about Alberta. They have 600,000 public school students, similar in size to the student population in both Oregon and Utah. And prior to 1994, which is when they went through their reform and have the system that they have now, their education system was similar to that in the U.S. That means schools were funded through a combination of local taxes levied and collected by municipalities and revenue from the provincial government. In 1993, discussions started to happen on how to reform their education funding system. And the biggest change in this was that property taxes were going to contribute to 32% of the total budget, where local school districts can no longer set their own property tax rates, nor do they spend the money raised from local property tax. Their tax dollars do not go to local school boards. The Alberta School Foundation Fund collects all funds and makes payments to each school board. All right, schools they receive money on a per student basis. They take the total money that is collected and they divide it by the number of public school students in that province, and that decides how much money each school is going to get. All right, here's a map that's going to show this, and it's kind of complicated, so let's start by looking at your provincial government here in the center. They set the tax rates on a people basis, meaning income taxes, corporate taxes, gaming, and they set property taxes. The people taxes go into a general revenue system, and this is the Alberta School Funding Formula, where they set their per district amount. That money is then given to the school districts. Property taxes are looked at, given to the Alberta School Foundation Fund that sets their per pupil dollar amount, which again equates to about 32%. They give their money to the school district. School districts then have an opportunity to increase property taxes 3% just for their school districts. All of that money is then put together and divided out into the schools. Schools then have an opportunity to charge student fees and set fundraising amounts. Let's talk about what student fees and fundraising look like. All right, student fees. This is going to be set by local school boards or principals, and it's for cost recovery items, so they can earn their money back on calculators, student planners, textbooks. Where fundraising is going to be for everything extra and is not allowed to be used for the things talked about in student fees. This is going to be for playground equipment, field trips, and sport uniforms. All right, and again, not allowed to use the money for school items. All right, British Columbia. They have more than 550,000 public school students, and they're one of the first provinces to move to the provincial level funding system in the early 1990s. Their money is allocated to school boards using a formula that combines property taxes with the general provincial funds, which means, unlike Alberta, property taxes are not separated from the people taxes and the general revenue funds. All money is allocated and combined into one fund. Let's look at their map. All right, so again, you have your provincial government, which is right here. They set your tax rates for the people for their income taxes, and then to the property owners. The money's all allocated into one general revenue fund and given to the school districts. School districts are again allowed to charge an additional property tax fee, but again, it's limited to a certain amount, and all that money is collected and then given to the schools. Schools are again allowed to charge student fees and have fundraising events to collect extra money. Ontario. This is the largest public school system in Canada, more than 2 million students. Before their 1998 reforms, school boards were funded through the joint provincial local funding system, and that was discussed before. Again, that's where your provincial government and the local government came together to provide funding for the schools, similar to what the U.S. does. This system is their new system is very similar to Alberta's new system. But unlike Alberta and British Columbia, Ontario's boards lost all power to raise any funding from local property taxes. So where you saw that Alberta and British Columbia were allowed to charge extra, Ontario cannot do that. So let's look at their map. All right, so the provincial government, again, they set the tax rates to the people and the property. Here you can see that they're then separated. Your people tax goes into your provincial or general revenue fund, and then your property taxes are going to be separate. Those two things come together to the school district, which then distributes the money out to the schools that are, again, allowed to charge those student fees and fundraising. All right, so let's connect a little bit of this back to the U.S. All right, I think the U.S. can learn 7 lessons from these 3 provinces. A state level funding system can create equity, so the state level funding would be similar to their provincial level funding. These three provinces were able to successfully transition from funding systems similar to the U.S. to systems funded at the provincial level with greater equality, if not total equity. These provinces show that there are several different models for implementing a provincial level funding scheme, and states could decide whether local school boards have the power to raise money, the amounts that they could raise, the way in which they can be raised, and the purpose that those funds would be used. These systems provide a strong commitment to local control over education, which would mean here our states would have more control over what's going on versus the federal government having more control. And in addition to equality and equity in school funding, a provincial level funding system offers the change for a state to provide districts with a stable and predictable level of education funding by establishing a funding cycle, and that's what we looked at with the maps. How are those funds going to be distributed? And last one, we talked about this at the very beginning, there is a distinction between equality, making sure that everybody gets the same amount, and equity, everybody getting what they need. Alright, there is a struggle. The United States is similar in size to Canada, however, child poverty is double that of Canada, and we all know poverty hinders student achievement. The level of income inequality is also less in Canada. There's not such a big change between the wealthy and the less wealthy. These differences mean it will be more challenging for the U.S. to adopt and execute a school funding system that's similar to Canada's. But it's not impossible. The United States could at least learn lessons from the education system in other countries, especially when it comes to school finance. Alberta, British Columbia, and Ontario provide models of how one type of education funding system might work. Most important, all schools need to receive the resources that they need to educate their children. Thank you. I hope you learned something.